Hey everyone, how's it going? You know that I love myself some hybrid damage and scoring decks, and I've been playing a bit of that Spiky Jinteki some time back. Well, it's time to apply that, this time to HB, with some interesting cards that we'll talk about right now, starting with Black Level Clearance. This is, a dream for anyone who loves spiky scoring decks, because Black Level Clearance helps with both aspects of the strategy. It can deal brain damage, which helps with the damage part obviously, but it can also defend your remotes by putting Black Level Clearance behind ice heavy remotes. It costs the runner a lot to get in, and by the time they get in, if they choose to end the run, then they'll have to run the server again just to see what's actually inside the server. So having this multiplier effect where the runner is forced to run through your remote ice multiple times it's a very big upside to Black Level Clearance. We note that Black Level Clearance is an interesting upgrade because it actually stacks with itself, unlike most other defensive upgrades where only at most one copy will take effect. By having multiple Black Level Clearances in the game, or rather in your scoring remote and res, this is what actually happens. Say the runner approaches the double Black Level Clearance and you res them both. After the successful run trigger, the runner gets to activate one of the Black Level Clearances and decides whether to jack out or take the brain damage. If they choose to jack out, right, so you gain 5 credits, you draw a card, and Black Level gets trashed. But the runner jacks out. This means that they're no longer in the run, and because of that, the trigger for the second Black Level Clearance actually fizzles. So even though the second Black Level Clearance triggered, it won't get to resolve, and as a result, the runner doesn't get to choose a second time between jacking out and taking brain damage, and the Black Level Clearance actually stays in the remote. This is the important part. If the runner wants to run the remote a second time, they will have to face the next Black Level Clearance. They have to face Black Level again. So potentially you can drag a runner through the remote multiple times, which is extremely amazing. So this is something that we actually get wrong during the game. JNet implements this wrongly, so I guess it's a bug. If you look up the unofficial FAQ, it is clarified that Black Level indeed works the way I just described. Anyway, just keep that in mind during the game. For now, we note that Black Level Clearance comes at a cost. It's not cheap to rest at all at 4 credits, so you pretty much have to play this with Breaker Bay Grid, which works, thankfully, because Black Level isn't a region. Now, of course, that's all fine and dandy assuming the runner actually chooses to end the run, thereby multiplying the effect of your ice. What if they take the brain damage instead? Well, we punish them with another card from the Wayland faction, Urban Renewal. This card deals 4 meat damage at the start of the corp's turn. This means that if the runner has a hand size of less than 4, they die to Urban Renewal immediately, assuming no damage prevention. That's amazing. This means that as long as you land 2 brain damage during the course of the game, Urban Renewal just threatens a flatline win outright. So that's amazing. Of course, most of the time this is not going to be the case. This brain damage isn't going to be set up perfectly most of the time. So instead, Urban Renewal still helps. It's more than just a tempo hit of 4 cards from the runner's hand. By firing an Urban Renewal, you basically set up a very good scoring window thereafter. Because assuming you have Black Level Clearances in your scoring remote, the runner needs to actually draw up before running your remote, thereby losing precious clicks. They can't run your remote with no cards in hand, otherwise they won't even have the option of taking the brain damage from Black Level Clearance. The other thing that Urban Renewal does is that it destroys the cards in the runner's hand, typically hand wiping the runner, and that's quite important because it will snipe certain key cards that will help them siege the remote more easily, typically cards like Stim Hack, which are very reliable ways of getting into the remote otherwise, are now not available to the runner. So Urban Renewal actually does a lot more than you might think at first sight. It actually does a pretty good job of setting up the score. Immediately after firing it, the runner's down to 0 cards, you go install double advance a card, chances are they can't really contest it. So that's the idea with this deck. And it works super well when you combine this with another card that sets up scoring very well in MC Austerity Policy. So so far we've been looking at damage cards, which are really nice, but now we need some cards that actually help us score agendas. To that end, MC Austerity is a strong card, as it always was, just because it's such a low risk card to use. At only 1 to res, it's, you know, it's a price that you're more than willing to pay anytime you draw into it. And of course, the 1 cost is offset if you have Breaker Bay Grid in the remote as well. It, you know, takes effect immediately from the get-go, unlike cards like Urban Renewal, which requires, you know, 2 or 3 turns to tick down. MC Austerity Policy works immediately as soon as you click it, because every turn the runner is going to lose that valuable 1 click, making them more vulnerable to the likes of Fairchild 3. Now, even if the runner somehow gets into your remote and trashes the MC Austerity Policy, you're still coming out ahead, because the runner probably spent a bunch of credits on that run for no material gain. They don't gain agenda points, we don't lose any. So MC Austerity, a very powerful card that allows you to get your agendas out of the way. Yeah, and get you up to 7 points pretty efficiently. So the idea with the deck is simple. We want to build a taxing remote ASAP. This doesn't need to be a super stacked remote. Typically people think of, you know, remotes with 4 or more ice dominated by surveyors and the like. No, all we really need is just a couple ice. You know, Fairchild 3 coupled with any ice in our deck more or less does the job. You'll be surprised how effective 2 pieces of ice is when it's multiplied by multiple black level clearances, or if the runner's going in only to find an MC Austerity or an Urban Renewal that doesn't even give them points. So yeah, just set up a very simple remote, jam the asset that you find. Typically you have 6 copies of it in your deck, 3 MCAs, 3 Urban Renewals. You're bound to find one someday. Just jam it in. If the runner ignores it, you get to score an agenda with MCA, or in the case of Urban Renewal, you kill their hand and you start advancing your agendas the next turn. If the runner contests it, now they're too poor. If they go down to like 0 credits, you can actually hard advance an agenda the normal way and score it anyway. So that's the plan with this deck. Just force the runner into a lose-lose situation like such, and take advantage of it by stacking black level clearances when the late game approaches. As the runner accumulates more resources to threaten your remote, the black level clearances mean that they can't that easily get in to challenge your assets. So that's the deck, and this is how it looks like. A couple more cards that I want to explain before we jump right into the game. Asa Group is the ID of choice because of our agenda suite. We are playing big agendas because MC Austerity means that we want to play big agendas. So Sports Metal just isn't going to really cut it. You're not going to get enough Sports Metal triggers to justify the ID. Instead, we're playing Asa Group, which makes a lot of sense because we're running lots of upgrades. So every time we draw a black level clearance, that's Asa Group fodder. Just install the black level alongside some piece of ice and you're good to go. This ID will trigger a lot of times over the course of the game. Restore is a very fun card to play with this deck because your key assets are limited in number. MC Austerity and Urban Renewal, you like to have them on tap, and Restore helps you do that. Typically the problem is if the runner has strong central pressure, they'll start trashing your Urban Renewals and MCAs from your centrals. So you have nothing to jam in the remote. But with Restore, you can fetch them from your bin and immediately install and res them and get them ready to go. It works best with MC Austerity because you can restore MCA and then click it in the span of the same turn. Very powerful combo that I was alerted to when sorry, I'm mispronouncing his name. Tug played a very powerful next design deck with the same agenda suite against me, and Restore MC Austerity proved to be a very powerful part of his deck. So that's something I learned from him and kind of inspired this deck as well. Restore works very well with both Urban Renewal and MC Austerity Policy and keeps the pressure going, most importantly, ensuring that there's always something in your remote that's threatening the runner. A very questionable restricted card and violet level clearance here. Almost every other HB deck goes for Global Food or Surveyor. The reason for violet level clearance here is simple. Even though it has basically the same numbers as Rashida Jahim, like you can argue that Rashida is basically superior to violet level clearance in almost every way, from not costing influence to not being 5 to play, and the fact that it doesn't flood your hand with cards and you have no clicks remaining since Rashida's not a terminal, unlike violet level. But hey, there are 2 important reasons why you are playing violet level here. Firstly, Having more level clearances is not a bad thing. We're already running black, why not run violet? But more importantly, this card draws us into the ice we need. The thing is, there's just not that much good ice in the game. I only want the best of the best ice. Fairchild 3 is awesome, Fairchild 2 is great, and the rest of the ice in my deck are pretty good as well. But past these ice, the power level of the ice drops out very quickly. I can't really find any other ice in the card pool that I'm really happy with, and honestly, you don't need to play a lot of your ice. So, you know, I'm willing to live with a deck that has, you know, 15 or 16 pieces of ice, so long as I draw into them, you know, at least 3 or 4 copies of them early on in the game, and violet level clearance gets me there. Right? So that's the whole point of it. The economy is just a bonus. This deck is very hungry on economy, which brings me to my next point. We are running all the neutral money agendas simply because we absolutely need the money. This deck is very poor. You'll find that out very soon as you begin rezzing your Fairchild 3s, and if somehow you don't manage to find a Breakaway grid, you're gonna have to pay the full price for those black levels. So the money is extremely important, and more importantly, it also gives you an incentive to pop the MC Austerity and immediately score your agenda, rather than clicking for credits, waiting for a good scoring window. Often the worry with scoring an agenda of MC Austerity is that it leaves the runner with a very strong stealing window, because now you are 3 clicks, 5 clicks behind, and a bunch of credits behind as well, because you spend all those resources advancing an agenda that does nothing. With SSL and the corporate sales team, at least you can narrow in that stealing window for the runner, making sure that they are not able to capitalize on you scoring an agenda to go for an agenda steal themselves. So yep, that's the deck. Let's give it a whirl and see how this crazy spiky HP deck performs. Alright, today our opponent is Mitochondria, so if there's one thing you learn from this video, is that Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. They are playing Kit, and typically Kit decks tend to be aggressive and very powerful in the early to mid game. We don't know there's Ungolo Kit just yet, but that is typically what you would expect from a Kit. They are powerful in the early to mid game because that's when they shine the best. When there's only 1 to 2 ice on each server, Kit can easily, guarantee access into any server between her ability and her code gate breaker. So that is when we are most vulnerable, and this is why we have to respect Kit's ability to get into our remote, which is why we are not constructing the black level remote just yet. Architect and IP block by themselves are not very good taxing ice, and the worst thing is if they run into our black levels early, before we get a decent amount of ice on the remote, it just won't be taxing enough. The black levels won't do enough. So even though it was very tempting to slap down that big bad Breakaway grid into black level clearance, we chose to wait for a third piece of ice, which would hopefully be more taxing. Unfortunately for us, we did not get it, and so we are gonna pay the iron price. Our entire hand are cards made full of cards that we do not want to throw away. 2 agendas, 2 Breakaways, and 2 black levels. I need all of them. You might think that Breakaway is the correct discard here since I don't need multiples, but in the unlikely event my opponent runs my HQ and accesses and trashes my Breakaway grid, I am very, very far behind, not being able to res my black levels for free. So I need all the redundant copies, just in case. So I put SSL endorsement in the bin. Worst case, they run it, they get 3 points, but I get 9 credits. I guess that's kind of okay. So now we are going to start protecting our black level with a Fairchild 2. Fairchild 2 is a super annoying ice, especially after I realized my opponent's actually on Ungolo. Ungolo at base strength 2 is pretty okay, but when you realize that Fairchild 2 is base strength 3, we get into a very interesting situation where Fairchild 2 only costs 4 for us to res, but 5 for them to break with Ungolo. So even though it's a code gate, even though it's porous, I'm more than happy to stack 2 Fairchild 2s on the remote, knowing that it will be super difficult for my opponent Kit to deal with. Now, not having drawn any MC Austerities or urban renewals means that I have to jam a proper corporate sales team agenda in the remote. I wouldn't like to do that usually. I would much rather put an asset in, but you need to put on the pressure every turn and force them to run like I'm doing here. So they stim hack into the remote, which is a good play. This means that they can cover the 10 credits needed to break the Fairchild 2s, but now they have to make a very difficult decision. there are going to be 2 black levels, which I raise for free in the remote. My opponent thinks that, you know, with 3 credits, I can't raise any defensive upgrades. Well, they're wrong. So now, they have to decide between taking 3 brain damage to access my sales team, which is obviously not going to happen, or letting the black levels fire. They have to jack out, they have to give me the card draw, they have to give me the credits. And yeah, that's the end of it all. Now, here's where JNet messes up. This is a bug. The second black level should not have even fired. So this is a JNet mistake. By right, the second black level should still be in the remote, guarding my remote. Well, regardless, we move on because, you know, we just move on. So I'm going to continue fortifying my remote here. You'll notice that I got 10 credits off the 2 black levels because my opponent jacked out twice. So it's a good time to use those credits to start building up my remote further, ensuring that my opponent doesn't get in again. That was amazing. You'll notice they only had 2 cards when they made the stim hack run, so they could not possibly have gotten the sales team because they were flatline on all the brain damage. So that was amazing, and scoring the sales team here is huge as it gives me a big burst of big amount of credits to rest my eyes across for the rest of the game. Now, unfortunately here they trashed the Urban Renewal from my hand, so I can't really showcase it. Instead, I'm gonna have to play the more boring asset in MC Austerity. I would actually honestly have rather put an Urban Renewal there, to be honest, because given the way agendas have fallen so far, it's quite likely that I won't draw another agenda to score with MC Austerity before Austerity goes up to 3 ticks. I would much rather put an Urban Renewal there, which, you know, impedes my opponent that much more. Either way, my opponent kind of is compelled to run the MCA here, and they seem very rich, right? They have 32 credits. Surely they can get through this remote, and the answer is, well, they can if they so choose. So I'm gonna rest all my eyes regardless, and all of them are gonna be a pain to break with Ngolo. My opponent just happens to have a very bad matchup here, because even though my deck is mostly full of code gates, meaning that Ngolo will have no problem smashing through all my ice, the problem is they're all base strength 3. So my opponent needs to spend 2 credits extra on every single ice pumping up that Ngolo, which doesn't retain strength during the entire run. So that's an extra 2 credits on Architect to pump it up to 6 strength, 2 credits, extra 2 credits to pump up for both Fairchild 2s as well. And I'm definitely contemplating resing the Fairchild 3, which is the only unres ice remaining on the server. So that's a very expensive server, right? We are talking 5 credits for each ice, 4 credits for Architect. So yeah, 19 credits just to run through the server once. That is an iron price to pay, isn't it? Very, very expensive server indeed. And this, yeah, you can see here how the brain damage racks up. Because Stim Hack is the card of choice for assaulting remote servers. Typically, runners will already be self-inflicting brain damage, so you don't need 2 black levels to fire. All you need is 1 black level to land the second brain damage in order for Urban Renewal to threaten an outright win. As you see here, I'm going to rest the black level, and my opponent's forced to jack out. They know that I'm running Urban Renewal. If they chose to continue the run and trash the MC Austerity, this turn, what I would easily have done is to restore the Urban Renewal and make them pay 19 credits to run through the remote again. Otherwise, they will flatline. They are on 2 brain damage. They have only 3 hand size. Urban Renewal flatlines with 4 meat damage. Right, so my opponent chose the smart choice. They chose not to take the brain damage. Instead, they jacked out, trashing black level clearance, and my MC Austerity gets to live another day. The problem with that is I can again use Restore for a different card. I did not expect to use Restore for a black level, but in this case it made perfect sense. Instead of risking my opponent spending 19 credits to run through my MCA and trashing it, I'm going to ensure that my MCA stays on the board by putting a 4th black level clearance essentially. I drew all my black levels early, and Restore served as my 4th black level clearance. With no other recursion in my deck, I didn't mind the fact that Restore removed the other 2 copies of BLC from the game. I didn't need them anymore. So this black level here should secure my server 1 for basically the entirety of the game. Can my opponent really afford to spend 19 credits running through the remote twice against a black level clearance? I didn't think so. So instead, they're now forced to contest my centrals. Right? They could have stolen the Ikawa on HQ, except that they couldn't because they didn't have 1 click left to steal it. Anyway, they didn't know about the Ikawa. They accessed last click and hit a Breaker Bay, a duplicate Breaker Bay, which they trashed. So that's fine. Here, I'm going to play Violet level clearance because I badly need to draw an agenda that is not Ikawa project. I do not want to score Ikawa project unless it's the game winning agenda. It's gonna set me back 5 credits and a lot of clicks. So I much rather score any other agenda, right? Ikawa is pretty safe in my hand anyways, and yes, I very luckily top deck in SSL, so making my life very easy there. Didn't have to think twice, just jam the SSL and score it. You'll notice that my opponent trashed an SMC here. They definitely could, you know, if they had a clot threat by having SMC installed, I would have to think twice about making the SSL play. But in any case, my opponent couldn't do the clock threat even because Ngolo and Magnum Opus both take up 2 memory, so my opponent had no memory for SMC. That's one of the downsides of playing Ngolo Kit. You are very short on memory, you can't really threaten clock very well. However, now my opponent threatens Imp. This is a very powerful card and one that I had to do a double take on. This potentially threatens my next turn win, so it is quite obvious here that my next line of play is to score the Ikawa in my hand, and most likely I'll be hard scoring it rather than using the MCA in my hand. Why score it in 3 turns when I can score it in 1? Against a Magnum Opus kit, they are going to earn money very fast, so I'd rather put the pressure on them, threaten match point rather than, you know, go the slow grindy route by using MCAs. So playing fast is my objective here, and I would be able to do so if not for the fact that my opponent has an Imp installed. Normally they can't steal the Ikawa here because they have no clicks to pay the additional costs, but my opponent had the Imp, so they could have Imp my Ikawa. Thankfully they missed the 1 in 4 Ikawa, so I was able to install double advanced hit here and basically call game. There was no way they were gonna make it through the remote. Well, technically they could. They could take a bunch of money and run my remote last click. Of course, if they run last click, they can't steal the Ikawa, but if they run second last click, they actually can let most of the subroutines on my Ice Fire, like the Fairchild 2s, and yeah, steal the Ikawa. So, they didn't do that, so that's basically game. Instead, they ran HQ, even though there were no agendas in there. So, you can see how the deck comes together very well, even though I did not get to showcase Urban Renewal. Even though my opponent did not flatline themselves, it's quite clear that the damage potential really scared them off, and it also makes my ice stronger. Normally you can just run through Fairchild 2 without really caring, you can trash your entire rig if it means stealing the agenda inside, but can you really afford to take all that brain damage when there's black level in the remote? That changes the equation entirely. So the brain damage complements Urban Renewal very well. Even if they somehow manage to Hail Mary my remote and steal the Ikawa in there, I simply jam the Urban Renewal and threaten the flatline win because they would take too much brain damage from the black level. Right? So that's how my deck comes together very well. And yeah, you know, my opponent ran my remote a few too many times, even though they had Magnum Opus economy and were flush with cash. My remote was just too much for them to deal with. So I think that was a very good game to showcase some important points about how to play good Netrunner and how to become a better player in general. Now, most of the time when you bring a deck to a game or a tournament, you usually have an overarching game plan, an idea of how you want to execute your strategy. And that's important, don't get me wrong. With this deck, for example, the idea was to tax the runner out by continuously putting undesirable assets in the remote. However, in this particular game, I was forced into a situation where my opponent was threatening me with a very powerful late game economy card in Magnum Opus with a Beth Curain Chang on the table. So every single turn there isn't something in the remote server, they're just going to hit Magnum Opus for 10 credits. And that is unacceptable because obviously that negates the taxation power of my remote server. So when given the opportunity to put a sales team in the remote, since I did not have any assets in my hand at that time, I did it, right? Even though it goes against my game plan, even though I want my agendas to stay safe in HQ rather than risk being stolen from the remote. In that situation, forcing the runner to run my remote and deal with the black levels and the 2 Fairchild 2s was preferable to letting them sit back, gain 10 credits off Magnum Opus, and set themselves up even better for stealing my agendas in the following turns to come. As a result, I was able to force my opponent into making a mistake where they stim hacked my server with only 2 cards in hand, and they couldn't deal with the three brain damage I was threatening between Stim Hack and the 2 black levels. So yeah, that trip up was a huge deal because not only did they accomplish basically nothing from that run, I was able to score the sales team later, putting me in a very strong position. So yeah, being able to recognize the points in the game where you have to defy and go against your overarching game plan that you set for yourself at the start is actually quite important. Playing Netrunner with a closed mind doesn't really help you out there. The other example of this came when I was going to play my Restore. As I mentioned in the card discussion, Restore was originally meant to be a 7th copy of my assets. 3 MCAs, 3 urban renewals. What if they get trashed from centrals? Well, you have Restore to back them up. In this case, however, I did have an asset going off. I had an MC Austerity in the remote with 1 power counter on it. So I didn't need to use Restore for assets, especially considering that I was already halfway to victory pretty much at that point. I didn't need more assets to jam in the remote. What I needed was a way to protect that MC Austerity because it wasn't protected by black levels. It was vulnerable to being run again by my opponent. So what did I do? Well, why not switch Restore's use and use it to protect existing ticking assets instead of recurring urban renewals or MCAs. So yeah, what I did, as you saw, I restored into BLC, and it really helped that there was a Breaker Bay grid there. Restore forces you to res the card that you just installed, and being able to res it for 0 credits thanks to Breaker Bay grid was a big deal, and basically deterred my opponent from running that remote ever for the rest of the game, even when I was threatening to win with the final agenda. That black level clearance is just such a big put off when you're already on 1 brain damage and the remote is so darn taxing. My opponent was forced to play on centrals for the remainder of the game, which was subpar. They didn't show any R&D or HQ multi-axis cards and weren't able to get any footing at all. So yeah, it's important to have an awareness of what your cards can do in addition to their usual use cases. Other things I could have done with Restore this game include installing the SSL endorsement that I ditched very early on in Archives. That agenda in Archives really put me, at the edge of my seat for the entire game because I knew they could easily, win the game just by running Archives and then getting a few more agendas here and there. One thing that I always had in mind was the ability to put the SSL from Archives back into play by using Restore on it. Another interesting thing I could have done was to reinstall Valuable Ice in case they got trashed by Ice Destruction. Of course, not relevant in this matchup because Shapers typically don't spot Ice Destruction, but against, Apocalypse decks, against Cutlery decks or Hippo decks, Restore could double up as a way to re-ice your servers after they get destroyed. So very important to keep all these use cases in mind and to keep an open mind over the course of the game. I think it's very easy to play a deck on autopilot mode and having an idea of how you want to execute your game plan even before starting the game, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, I would encourage you to be very critical about all the cards in your deck and know what they're for, but the most important part is never hesitate to deviate from what you think is the best use case if you can justify it. Because that's what separates a good player from a great one. The ability to adapt on the spot and to make the fullest use of the cards available at your disposal. Hope you learned something interesting besides, the fun of Spiky HB. I hope the gameplay tips are useful in your games as well. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Happy net running.